I'm Christian Daytalk, reporting for the Washington Examiner at the DNC in Chicago, and I'm joined by none other than Bakari Sellers, former South Carolina state representative, a former co-chair of Kamala Harris's 2020 campaign, and a CNN commentator. Now, Bakari, obviously living down in South Carolina, you hear a lot of talk about Democrats not only winning Georgia maybe, but winning North Carolina, winning Florida. We've heard about Texas being in play for cycles now. I'm not going to ask you if the vice president can win those states. What I'm going to ask you is, what do you think she needs to do to sort of build up this blue wall in the South?
And so that's a really good question. I didn't know that's where we were going to start, but that's a really probing question and a good question, because for us who think about the strategy behind it all, it's not as much winning as making Republicans defended.
Okay.
And you have states like North Carolina and Georgia that are definitely in play. You have states like Florida. They're going to take a couple more years of organizing, but this is a central election to that. And Texas is always a dream for Democrats. It always seems, a few 100,000 votes outside of our grasp when we see, hundreds of thousands of people sitting at home. I believe one of the things she has to do over this next 80 days is continue to meet voters where they are. One of the things that the vice president has done extremely well, contrary to probably when she first became vice president, is get outside of the Washington bubble. And when she's out on the campaign trail like she is today in Pennsylvania, like she'll be on Tuesday in Wisconsin, that's when she does her best. She'll do well because of the demographics in both North Carolina and Georgia. Florida is a very interesting and expensive state, but we are seeing, improving polls there. And we're seeing her do well in what used to be Democratic strongholds. I'll be the first one to tell you I was so surprised on election night in 2016 when Donald Trump flipped Florida first. And not only flipped Florida, but did extremely well in the southern part of the state. And so I think that this is a new trajectory that we're on. We just have to see where it takes us.
You mentioned the demographics of the South. Obviously, black voters were integral to Joe Biden's victory in 2020. Sure. Donald Trump this past spring was polling, close to 20%, and that doesn't come close to what Kamala Harris does. It doesn't come close to what Joe Biden does. But it is basically twice as well as he performed with black voters in 2016. What can the vice president do to sort of slow, and I know black voters aren't a monolith, but
Correct.
Slow this move to the right in a traditionally Democratic
And that's
voting bloc?
another good question that you're asking. And I've always, I joked with Speaker McCarthy not long ago, or former Speaker McCarthy, or Speaker Emeritus, whatever his title is now. But I said, if you think that Donald Trump's going to get 20% of the black vote, I have a bridge in Brooklyn to sell you. I thought the polls were overselling that a little bit, but it did show that Democrats had to do more work in focusing energy and not taking that vote for granted. I think you're starting to see that change. Many of the most recent polls have Kamala Harris at 78, 80% of the black vote, Donald Trump at the 5, 6, 7, 8%. I think she has the ability to reach 90% plus. I think that Donald Trump will stay well under 10%, but for her, it's a game of turnout. And my analysis of the race hasn't changed much since her entry versus Joe Biden. I've always told people this is a 3-person race. It just happens to be this case. It's Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump versus the couch. How many voters stay home is the question.
Are you seeing, since the Democrats shifted their ticket, to your point about the couch, a renewed sense of enthusiasm? Yes. Obviously, there's been big fundraising numbers, but how can you tell the difference given how untrustworthy polls have been the last 2-3 cycles?
And I tell people the polar coaster is not a real life experiment. Because people think polls today are going to be what happens, and polls are just snapshots in time. But how it's palpable is you go out in the street and you meet people at Piggly Wiggly, you meet them at the Bilo, you see them at the post office, people are talking, the energy is different. This is probably not a fair in Chicago, just a fair evaluation of how much energy there is, although you'll see it. Because we are Democrats gathered here today for like a singular cause and a common good. But you do see that same energy, whether or not it's in Arizona or Vegas, or, I've seen rallies in places like Colorado and Milwaukee. We saw North Carolina. Even South Carolinians are asking, what can we do? And how can we get to Georgia, or how can we get to North Carolina to help? So the energy is definitely different. But one of the things we know is that MAGA energy is real. We learned that in 2016. There are also a lot of voters who will vote for Donald Trump and will never tell you or a pollster that they're voting for Donald Trump. We learned that in 2016 as well.
I want to pick your brain on policy for just a second, because the vice president put out the first part of her platform focusing on the economy this past week. Some parts were received well, some were criticized, but she has generally faced a lot of questions about what do you actually believe. She's disavowed a lot of positions she had on that 2020 campaign that you supported. How do you square the candidate that she is right now with the person you supported in 2020?
No.
And what do you think voters need to be thinking about in terms of what a Harris agenda will look like?
First of all, I'm looking forward to September 10th because that's going to be an opportunity for her to kind of answer a lot of those questions. And I think she, like J.D. Vance, having to answer questions about how do you call Donald Trump Hitler and now support him, have to answer those questions. But I think there's been a lot of growth in the then Senator, now Vice President Harris. I think serving with Joe Biden over the past 4 years or 3.5 years to get to this point, I think the successes that we've had with the Inflation Reduction Act, I think the successes you've had with the transportation bill, I think have put her in a different position wholly of how to govern now versus 2020. But there's also something that's very real about her way that she's approaching the economy or her economic policy. For example, she's acknowledging the pain that voters are feeling. She's not saying, oh my God, we had a panacea, we fixed all that pain is not real. She's actually acknowledging that there still is work to be done. And so, yeah, I like the fact she put out robust policy proposals. I like the housing proposal, not the $25,000 that everybody gets caught up on for down payments for first-time home
The tax incentives for new construction.
The tax incentives for new constructions, which go to home builders, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if anybody knows anything, this is in the weeds, but home builders, the Conference of Home Builders are not traditionally Democratic voters, right? But that is something that is good policy, good economic policy, brings them to the table and builds the 3 million homes we need because we have a housing shortage. It's that type of thinking. And if you criticize it, if you criticize her on the policy level, that's fair and fine, because I think those are the discussions people want to have. They don't want to have the petty differing and bickering about personalities. People want to be able to have this discussion about policy. So I look forward to her. The onus is on her, September 10th, to answer the questions that you're asking. But I think the policy she's put out so far, not raising taxes on people who make less than $400,000, et cetera, no taxes on wages, on tips, are just a good start.
Well, Bakari, thank you for your time. Enjoy Chicago. And to everyone at home, you can follow along with our DNC coverage and the latest political news at washingtonexaminer.com.